Speaking of metals, let's go to the first one then. So the Platinum Age. That kicks off from about 1897 with one of the first newspaper comic strips. Yes, no superheroes though. This is the precursor of the medium, right the way through to 1938. And we have a definite cut-off point when the Platinum Age ends, which we don't always get with most ages. Some of them get more nebulous as they go on, but this one's pretty concrete and set in stone. And the first regular serialized, non-reprinted comic was by Dell Publishing's The Funnies, and that was 1929. And it was 16 pages, 10 cents, and it was just printed in 4-color color. So very rudimentary. They were normally funny animal stories or the Charlie Brown type stuff.
Yes.
It was fairly innocuous. This one lasted 36 issues, but it was pretty unprofitable. Barely anyone bought it. Prices then tripled between issues 3 and 22 to make up for lacking sales, and then plummeted to 5 cents from issue 22 until issue 36. So some of these titles included, and this was around the same time.
So the publishers got a rudimentary lesson in basic economics there.
Yeah. We will actually see that happening again in the Bronze Age, because there was a DC implosion, and that was around the time of the Carter administration's massive inflation, but also there was a giant snowstorm that stopped any of the trucks distributing everything, so it cut loads of titles like Dead Man and Black Lightning before they even properly got off the ground. So
that's a shame for those writers who were involved, I'd imagine.
It killed a lot of creativity. Fortunately, later on in the Bronze Age, some of those characters had a bit of a rebirth in Amalgam Comics, but this is part of the reason I wanted to do this, is because there's so many political and social factors that actually influence your art coming out, particularly in a serialized medium like comics, which back in the day was actually concerned about selling numbers to consumers.
What a shock.
Novel concept, I know. Some of the characters of this time included Little Nemo, Dick Tracy, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, Popeye, and Tarzan. So they had a bit of a mix of swashbuckling heroes, sci-fi characters, but no superheroes yet.
Interestingly enough as well, if you want to talk about the evolution of mediums, you can see in the, I think, 1930s, 40s, and 50s, characters like Tarzan and Flash Gordon would later get put onto the serials on television, which would later go on to inspire their own films in the 1980s and other films like Indiana Jones. So it's interesting how the medium really branches out in that way and influences a lot of other developments.
Well, the serials were more movies first, and I think the first serial, I think we'll talk about it later, but I think Captain Marvel got his own movie serial before Superman. I could be misremembering. Like Batman had a serial in the early 40s as well.
I've got fuzzy black and white images in my head of a really cheap looking Batman outfit.
We'll have to flash them up for the audience. Walt Disney also started producing Mickey Mouse comics in 1930, so he predates Superman by 8 years. There are also Tijuana Bibles. Are you familiar with those?
No, I'm not.
So do you remember in Watchmen, when Silk Spectre visits her mother, Silk Spectre, and she finds a little porno comic, and she was sent it by fans. She said, I think it's flattering. So Tijuana Bibles were these little matchbook comics of attractive ladies.
All right.
Yeah, and they were called Tijuana because they were believed to have been created by organized crime, and the rumor was it was smuggled across the border from Mexico to the US, but it could well have been the mob as well, because
it certainly wouldn't have been produced legally, would it?
They would have evaded obscenity laws. I don't know how explicitly illegal it was, because I think some of them were sold on newsstands, but it more could have been that it wasn't properly enforced. But I think we'll see throughout this that the mob could have been quite heavily involved in the comic book publishing industry.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've found some sources that suggest so. There's no confirmation, so I don't want to besmirch the good memory of anyone involved in Marvel and DC and the like, but there was at least one man who was good friends with Lucky Luciano.
Oh, really?
Yeah, who I've done an Epochs on with Bo fairly recently.
Which you should also watch.
Yeah, he was, for those who don't know, the man who started the Commission, the Five Families, which included Al Capone. So he ran organized crime throughout the 30s and 40s. So it could say he was a bit of a shady character, but yeah. Detective pulps were also quite popular during the time, and they began with Detective Comics #1 in 1937. The cover to that hasn't aged well.
Has it not? Is he fighting some Asian stereotype?
The whole cover is just a giant Asian stereotype.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
With a big pigtail and fangs. Yeah, the lead character in that was Slam Bradley, who has since shown back up in Catwoman comics by Darwin Cook and Ed Brubaker.
Really?
But he was the precursor to Superman. He was a Captain Marvel-looking, eraser-necked, big, chunky, fists first private detective.
So prior to that sort of design trend, were the men featured in these earlier comics that you're talking about, were they more every everyman types, or were they the big aspirational burly men?
They were aspirational, but they weren't explicitly superheroes. I mean, of course, Tarzan was shredded, but he was more of an adventurer.
He's raised by monkeys in the jungle, so he's going to have to be to survive.
Yeah, or Dick Tracy or Flash Gordon. I mean, pretty much everyone's seen the 80s Flash Gordon movie. It's not that far from the original comics, other than the Queen music, of course. And then Bradley continued to be a backup in Detective Comics until 152 in October 1949. So he had a pretty good innings as a precursor character. So DC Comics specifically, because they were the first giant on the scene. I mean, we've spoken about DC far more than we have Marvel. It's probably because of our relative more familiarity with DC, but they've got a long and storied history. They've got about 35 years on Marvel as well. So Detective Comics #1 was published. Printer and distributor Harry Donenfeld, and this was National Periodical Publications. That was what they were titled at the time. And his business partner, Jack Leibowitz, bought the head of National Periodicals, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, out of it because Nicholson was on the verge of bankruptcy. Nicholson had produced the New Fun comics that were the really early comics that were floating around at the time. So they were the funny animal comics that had come out of the newspaper comic strips, the ones that had been reprinted and unprofitable. They decided to double down and really make a go of it. So he was a pioneer.
They were, you buy a newspaper, here's something for the kids to enjoy.
Yeah, it's like Looney Tunes. Yeah. So the stories were a hell of a lot more superficial and inoffensive, which is quite humorous given the accusations that we'll get onto later from Frederick Wortham. The company was then renamed National Periodical Publications after National Allied Publications was bought out. Leibowitz headed the accounting and creative parts of DC, so he was the head of the Detective Comics division, and then Donenfeld handled and expanded the distribution through his company, Independent News Company. And Independent News Company will come up later because they ended up doing a contract with Marvel, and DC were mainly outselling Marvel Comics when Marvel properly kicked off in the early 60s because they were artificially throttling their distribution in the newsstands because Marvel was being distributed by DC's parent company. Silly idea, but
so what was DC originally called again?
So it was National Allied Publications, and then it changed to National Periodical Publications when Leibowitz and Donenfeld bought it off of Nicholson.
All right.
And he could do that because it turns out that Donenfeld was the guy that was friends with Lucky Luciano.
He had mob connections, or so went the rumors at the time. It didn't help that he bragged about knowing Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello.
So I wonder where he got this money from.
How willing was the original owner to sell it in the first place?
Well, he did go bankrupt. So
so there is some incentive there.
Yeah, we can assume that he needed to get out of a tight spot, and that the guys made him an offer that they couldn't refuse.
Yeah, well,
who knows?
I suppose any amount of money.
Yep. He had actually almost gone to prison once for spicy pulps. So those were the detective stories that may have ran afoul of the obscenity laws because of the scantily clad women in distress on their covers. They're not quite Tijuana Bibles, but they were offensive to sensibilities at the time.
Yes, saucier than was expected.
Yeah, and he managed to not face prison time. Wonder if he called a favour in there, but okay. So Donenfeld then remained president of DC until his death in 1965. So he had a good tenure there. Leibowitz remained at DC until 1970, and then moved onto the board of directors with Warner Brothers, and he died in 2000. And Warner Brothers, as you now currently know, owns DC for better or for worse. And so that sets the stage for our jumping into the Golden Age, in particular Bound, because the thing that sets off the Golden Age is the invention of Superman with Action Comics in 1938. So before superheroes had come along, there were a few characters in the detective pulps. So I'm pretty sure you might be familiar, if you're a Razor Fist viewer, particularly, with the Phantom.
Yes. Is it not the Shadow?
So the Shadow is also there, but the Phantom, that Billy Zane played him in a movie.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with
He's in a strange purple outfit. I will bring up the Shadow in a moment.
All right, okay.
He was in a newspaper strip starting on February 17th, 1936. He had absolutely no superpowers, but he fought crime in a costume. And Batman the Animated Series viewers might know this because he was originally named the Grey Ghost.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is an episode of Batman the Animated Series, for those who don't know.
Classic episode.
Where Batman was inspired to become Batman by a childhood superhero he used to watch in movie serials called The Grey Ghost, and it was voiced by the late Adam West, obviously, who played Batman in the 1996
It was a wonderful tribute.
Series. Yeah, it's a really, really wholesome episode. There was also the Crimson Avenger, who was in Detective Comics before Batman. He was in Detective Comics number 20, so 7 issues before, and he was masked, and he used a firearm to fight crime, much like Batman as well, because most people don't know that Batman actually used to carry a gun. Again, Batman
for his first few years, it is quite funny to see those old panels.
Well, it's when he's throwing men into vats of acid, not named the Joker, and staking vampires through the heart.
Oh, my favourite one is when he's in his bat helicopter, hangs a noose down, and hangs a man to death who had escaped from the circus, I believe the character had, and then says, well, it was a mercy.
Based. And then there's also The Shadow, and he was created for a radio program called Detective Story Hour, not to be confused with Drag Queen Story Hour. And then he was given his own magazine to cater because the viewers had major demand. And this is also Razorfist's particular favourite character.
I've heard that there is some contention over whether Batman is a more or less direct rip-off of The Shadow. I've not really engaged with any Shadow literature myself, so I can't give my own view on that.
There is substantiated rumors that the Joker was a rip-off of a character from The Shadow.
Oh, really?
I'll mention that later when we go through Bob Kane and Bill Finger's saga creating Batman, because Bob Kane was a hack. There's no two ways about it. He had a sizable influence on the industry with the co-creation of Batman, but he stole art. He suppressed credit for
It has to be noted as well that whenever you hear Bob Kane brought up, it is only ever in relation to the first few years of Batman. And other than that, the only other notable things anybody ever brings up about him are the controversies that he's involved in. I'm not aware of any other characters that he created.
He tried to make a couple and they didn't quite stick.
Yeah.
So before we talk specifically about superheroes, as in which ones were created, I wanted to talk a little bit more about why they're so synonymous with the industry, and particularly why did they come out of America? Because most people might not understand around the time the pressures, the social pressures, the economic pressures that were bearing down on the people in the comic book industry. The comic book industry was, as you'll probably hear as we go through, made up almost unilaterally of the sons of Jewish immigrants. Stan Lee, for example, was Stanley Lieber, and his dad was a Romanian Jewish immigrant that came over to start a new life in America. The cities, particularly the publishing houses, were one of the only things that were still running at the time and still hiring, and so that attracted a lot of up-and-coming, quite intelligent young men. Sometimes it was nepotism that they got hired by. So Timely Comics was one of the precursor names to Marvel. And Stan Lee got a job there as an intern at 17 because his cousin's husband was running the publishing department. So that's one of the only ways you would get work. But why particularly did superheroes germinate from America? Of course, there was an outcry, sort of need for a self-empowerment fantasy for disenfranchised young men at the time, and that's not to be scoffed at. There was also the fact that there wasn't really much in the way of entertainment else going on. There were movie serials, as you've alluded to.
They came out in the late 1930s when America was still in the grips of the Great Depression. So I'm expecting the Great Depression had something to do with this, something to embolden the American spirit during a time of great difficulty. And then during the war years, I'm expecting as well that they became, I know that they became a great tool of wartime propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was because the American spirit, I think it's fair to say, felt a fair bit crushed, because if America was meant to be the shining city on a hill, something we've covered before in our podcast on Christian nationalism, then it felt like the dream was not being fulfilled by the people that were running America, the people that permitted Wall Street to bankrupt the country, Roosevelt elongating the Depression despite promising not to. And
that's always an interesting thing to me. I don't want to derail at all, but in the 1930s, obviously nowadays, the Roosevelt administration is held up in typical histories as being a great savior of America. The New Deal saved America. It didn't. All you need to do is do some rudimentary reading on Thomas Sowell, and he will dispel that myth immediately. It extended the Great Depression. In the 1930s, was Roosevelt seen as this kind of savior that he's depicted as these days, or was it more acknowledged within the wider public that he's making things worse?
I think because of adverse economic conditions, as far as I know, I'm no expert, his popularity was somewhat waning on the lead up to the war. And then Pearl Harbor did happen, which was very convenient. And it just so happens they had some forewarning about that, and they knew it was going to happen in advance. And then as soon as America entered the war, of course, Roosevelt had an excuse to violate the Constitution and stay on as a third-term president.
I don't think that actually was ever violating the Constitution itself. I think it was after he had stayed on and it became clear that he was doing so.
You might be correct there.
Irresponsibly, shall we say, especially given the adverse condition of his health. that afterwards, then they made it a rule.
They drafted a 2-term amendment. Okay, I'm happy for that correction. Thank you very much. But I don't think that people were too happy on the ground with the fact that their material conditions were not being ameliorated as expected, as particularly promised. The Foundation for Economic Education has a really good breakdown on their website about how the Great Depression policies actually made it much, much worse. So again, I'm no economist, but as far as I can see, Roosevelt's big socialist state spending policies didn't help America all that much. So particularly going back to the point of superheroes as a kind of secular American monomyth, I see them in the same vein as the frontiersmen, as the founding fathers. It's the new religious self-definitive myth, particularly as a cultural export that can be pushed around the world to extol American values and share American supremacy.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.